On January 28, 1986, 73 seconds after liftoff, the Space Shuttle Challenger ceased to be a spacecraft and became a fireball. 17% of the American population was watching live. Children in classrooms across the country saw it happen in real time, and in that instant, 7 people vanished into a plume of white smoke against a brilliant Florida sky. But here is the question almost nobody asked in the hours that followed. What happened after the fire? What happened when the cameras stopped rolling, when the news anchors went silent, when the families were led away from the viewing stands? Because the shuttle did not simply disappear, the crew did not simply vaporize. And what came next? What happened to the bodies of those 7 astronauts in the hours, days, and months after the explosion is a story NASA never wanted to tell. The Navy refused to discuss for years, and the families have carried in private ever since. The morning began cold. Unusually, dangerously cold. Ice coated the launch pad. Engineers at Morton Thiok, the company that built the shuttle's solid rocket boosters, had warned against launch. The O-rings sealing the booster segments were not designed to function in temperatures that low, but the pressure was immense. The mission had already been delayed 6 times. Christa McAuliffe, the 37-year-old schoolteacher from New Hampshire, was scheduled to give a lesson from space that very afternoon. President Reagan was to deliver his State of the Union address that evening, and he planned to mention the first teacher in orbit. The machine of expectation was too large to stop. So at 11:38 a.m. Eastern Time, Challenger lifted off. For 58 seconds, everything looked perfect. Then, at 59 seconds, a flicker of flame appeared on the right solid rocket booster. It was small. It was brief. It was enough. At 73 seconds, the external fuel tank collapsed. The shuttle broke apart. But here's the first thing most people do not know. The crew compartment did not explode. It did not burn. It remained intact. A reinforced aluminum cone designed to withstand the forces of re-entry, it separated from the disintegrating shuttle and began to fall. For 2 minutes and 45 seconds, it tumbled end over end in a ballistic arc, climbing 3 miles higher before gravity reclaimed it, then plummeting 65,000 feet toward the Atlantic Ocean. Inside were 7 human beings. Some were still strapped into their seats. Some may have been conscious. We know this because of what the divers found later. The impact with the water was catastrophic. The crew compartment hit the surface at over 200 miles per hour, subjecting the structure to a force of roughly 200 Gs. It sank to the ocean floor, 100 feet down, coming to rest in a debris field scattered across an area the size of several football fields. And there it stayed. While the world mourned, while the Rogers Commission investigated, while President Reagan spoke of slipping the surly bonds of Earth, the remains of 7 people sat in the dark, under crushing pressure, waiting. NASA initially told the public that the crew had died instantly in the explosion. It was a kind fiction, perhaps intended to spare the families, perhaps intended to spare the agency. But the truth was more complicated, and the evidence would not allow the simple narrative to stand. Recovery operations began immediately. The Navy sent ships, divers, and deep-sea submersibles to the impact zone off the coast of Cape Canaveral. They were not just looking for wreckage, they were looking for bodies. And what they found would haunt them. The crew compartment was located within days, but the conditions were brutal. Murky water, strong currents, limited visibility. It took weeks to plan the recovery of the compartment itself. In the meantime, divers searched the debris field. They found pieces of the shuttle, they found personal effects, and they found human remains. The first body was recovered within hours of the disaster. Others took longer. Some were found inside the crew compartment when it was finally brought to the surface in March, more than 6 weeks after the explosion. The condition of those remains varied. The force of impact had done what the explosion and the fall had not. But then came the detail that changed everything. When investigators examined the wreckage inside the crew compartment, they found evidence that at least some of the astronauts had activated their personal egress air packs. These were emergency oxygen devices mounted beside each seat. Activation required a deliberate motion, reaching down and pulling a metal ring. They were not automatic. They were not triggered by the breakup. Someone had to pull them. And at least 3, possibly 4 of the PEAPs had been activated, which meant that after the explosion, after the fall began, some members of the crew were alive. They were aware enough to reach for emergency oxygen. They knew something had gone wrong. and they tried to survive. Whether they remained conscious all the way down, whether they felt the impact, whether they experienced those final 2 minutes and 45 seconds in full awareness, nobody can say for certain. The peeps provided unpressurized air. At the altitude they were falling from, consciousness would have been difficult to maintain, but the fact remains, they did not die in the fireball. They died in the dark, in the cold, in the fall, or in the crash. And NASA knew it. The recovery of the bodies was handled with extraordinary secrecy. The Navy divers who performed the work were sworn to silence. Many of them never spoke publicly about what they saw. But years later, some would describe the experience in interviews and memoirs. They spoke of descending into black water, of using their hands more than their eyes, of touching metal and knowing they were close. They spoke of the compartment on the ocean floor, intact but wrong, sitting at an angle in the sand, and they spoke of what was inside. The remains were not complete. The impact had fragmented what the explosion and the sea had left behind. Identification required dental records, x-rays, and in some cases the serial numbers on pieces of flight suits. It was forensic work done underwater, under pressure, under the weight of knowing that the entire world was waiting above the surface, but could never be allowed to see what they were seeing. Commander Francis Scobie's body was recovered from the ocean floor. Pilot Michael Smith's remains were found in the crew compartment. Ronald McNair, the physicist and saxophonist, who had already survived racism and poverty to reach space twice, was identified through dental records. Ellison Onizuka, the first Asian American in space, who carried a soccer ball aboard that would later reach the International Space Station 30 years later, was found among the wreckage. Judith Resnick, the brilliant engineer with the radiant smile, was identified. Gregory Jarvis, the payload specialist who had been bumped from an earlier flight and finally gotten his chance, was recovered. And Christa McAuliffe, the teacher who had trained for a year to carry the hopes of every student in America into orbit, was found in the debris. The bodies were brought aboard recovery ships in body bags, transferred with military precision and human grief to the Naval Hospital in Charleston, South Carolina. There, a team of pathologists and forensic specialists worked in closed rooms to confirm what the families already feared. The process took days. The families were not shown the remains in the condition they were found. In most cases, they were advised against viewing. The damage was too severe. What happened next varied by family, and those choices tell their own stories about grief, faith, and the need to reclaim dignity from horror. Commander Dick Scobie was cremated. His ashes were scattered by his family in a private ceremony, returned to the air he had spent his life trying to conquer. Michael Smith was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, his grave marked by a stone that speaks of flight and service. Ronald McNair was buried in his hometown of Lake City, South Carolina, though not without one final indignity. The local cemetery initially refused to allow a black man to be interred there. It took an act of legal pressure and national attention to secure his resting place. Today, the land around his grave is a memorial park bearing his name. Ellison Onizuka was buried in Hawaii, on the island where he had grown up watching the stars he would one day touch. Judith Resnick was laid to rest in Arlington National Cemetery as well, her grave a place of pilgrimage for young women who see in her short life a version of what they might become. Gregory Jarvis was buried in New York, near the home he had shared with his wife. And Christa McAuliffe was returned to New Hampshire, to the town of Concord where she had taught, where she had laughed, where she had packed her bags a year earlier believing she would come back to tell her students what Earth looked like from above. She was buried in Blossom Hill Cemetery. Her grave draws visitors still, people who leave apples and pencils and notes written in children's handwriting. But there is one more body, one more piece of this story that most accounts overlook. The Challenger crew compartment, once emptied and examined, was not simply discarded. It was placed in a missile silo at Cape Canaveral Air Force Station, along with other wreckage deemed too sensitive or too painful to display. It became a tomb without bodies, a monument without a plaque. The bodies had been removed, identified, and returned to their families. But the shell that carried them, the metal cocoon that had protected them through the explosion only to deliver them to the ocean, remained as evidence, as warning, as grave marker. NASA changed after Challenger. Not just its engineering, not just its management. The way it handled death changed. The way it spoke to families changed. The agency created new protocols for body recovery, for forensic identification, for psychological support of recovery teams. Because the men who dove to that wreckage, who brought up what was left of 7 human beings, who had to look at what 200 Gs of impact did to the human form, those men carried scars that no debriefing could heal. Some left the Navy, some left diving forever, some drank, some simply never spoke of it again. And the families? They were told the official story first, the instant death narrative, only to learn later that it was not that simple. Some were angry, some were grateful for the lie. Some have spent 4 decades wondering whether their husband, their wife, their parent, their child reached for that oxygen ring in panic or in hope, in pain or in professional calm, alone or aware of the others falling beside them. The PEAPs do not answer those questions. They only confirm that the questions exist. The Challenger disaster is often remembered as a moment of national trauma, a failure of technology and hubris, the day a teacher died on live television. But it was also a story of what happens after the explosion, of bodies that did not burn, of a fall that lasted nearly 3 minutes, of divers who descended into darkness to bring home what they could, of pathologists who worked in silence, of families who had to choose between cremation and burial, between viewing and remembering, between anger and acceptance, of a crew compartment that became a tomb, then evidence, then a silenced memory. 7 people left Earth that morning. 7 people did not come back. But they were not lost. They were found. They were identified. They were returned. And in that return, in the grim, necessary human work of recovering the dead, there is a different kind of courage than the kind we celebrate in astronauts. It is the courage to descend into cold water and touch what remains. The courage to tell a family the truth when the truth is worse than the lie. The courage to bury a teacher while the nation watches. The courage to look at a piece of wreckage and see a person. The shuttle program resumed 2.5 years later. New astronauts strapped into new shuttles. New teachers were selected, though none would fly in the same capacity. New O-rings were designed, but the bodies of the Challenger crew remain where they were placed by their families, in cemeteries and scattered on winds, while the crew compartment remains in its silo, and the ocean floor where it fell still holds fragments no diver retrieved. The story did not end at 73 seconds. It ended in recovery rooms and funeral homes, in graveside ceremonies and private scatterings, in the quiet moments when a widow or a child or a parent visits a stone and knows that beneath it lies someone who reached for oxygen in the dark, who fell for 3 minutes, who was found and named and brought home. Space is unforgiving. It does not care about lesson plans or presidential speeches or the dreams of children watching in classrooms. But the men and women who go there, and the men and women who bring them back when things go wrong, they care. And the final chapter of the Challenger disaster, the one written in body bags and burial plots and the silent grief of Navy divers, proves something that the explosion itself could not. That even when the sky rejects you, even when the machine fails, even when the fall is long and the impact is absolute, we do not leave our dead behind. We go down into the dark, we find them, we name them, and we bring them home.